Welcome to Module 14 of Interpersonal Communication, Research on the Initiation and Growth of Friendships. In this module, we'll try and answer the question, how did you come to be friends with the people you were friends with? Were you looking for something specific? Did it just happen? And what communicative forces were at work that you might even not have been aware of that led you to friendship? So think about this. Why are you friends with the people you're friends with? How did you come to be friends with them? Most of us never really think about those kinds of questions, yet research clearly tells us that there are certain dynamics at work that lead us to friendships. And once you understand those dynamics, you can more clearly see the communicative manifestations of those dynamics. And so oftentimes when people talk about where our friends come from, we talk about the concept of prospecting for friends. The notion of prospecting calls into mind this idea of miners in California in the 1800s that were prospecting for gold. That is to say, you're looking for something. Oftentimes, real estate agents are looking for prospects, people that might want to sell their home or people that might want to buy a home. They're trying to find someone with whom they can have a relationship. So what most researchers say is that whether we know it or not, all of us at various points in time are prospecting for friends. So how is it that we go about this notion of prospecting for friends? Well, various researchers have done research that speaks into that. Let's start with this. One way to think about how we come to have friends is by prospecting through exclusion. This is the research of Mary Roden, and Roden argues that the way we tend to find friends is by saying, I don't want to be friends with that person, or I'm not going to be friends with that kind of person. So really, we come to be friends not by choosing people, but by excluding people. It's prospecting by exclusion. And in this, Roden talks about two kinds of criteria that we use: dislike criteria and disregard criteria. Dislike criteria is that we see something in someone else that we don't like. It can be something as shallow and simplistic as the fact that their laugh sounds like a donkey. It can be something deeper that says, you know what? I just don't want to be friends with someone who believes in corporal punishment for their kids. So the idea is there's something we perceive in someone else that we don't like. And so because we perceive that dislike in them, we scratch them off of our list of possible friends. Now, all of this might occur in an instant. All of it might occur because of unfair stereotyping. All of this might be entirely perceptual, but it's real. And so Roden argues that we oftentimes encounter people and mentally cross them off our list because of something about them that we don't like. Disregard criteria, on the other hand, is when we won't even consider being friends with someone. We completely put them in a category of never going to be friends with that person. We don't even get to know them well enough to know there's something about them we don't like. It's just ipso facto, right off the bat, we disregard any possibility of friendship with that person. Sadly, we know from some research that racial prejudices oftentimes lead to disregard. Significant religious differences can sometimes lead to disregard. Significant age differences can sometimes lead to disregard. Now, disregard is unfair. Disregard is sad in many ways, but it's reality. And Roden is not trying to make any kind of a moral value judgment about disregard criteria. She's simply saying this is how it is, that we disregard some people for friendship for all kinds of reasons. So whether it be dislike criteria or disregard criteria, Roden believes that one way we oftentimes come to our friendships is by crossing people off the list. Now, before we press on, let me say a couple more things. First, these different ways of prospecting for friends are not mutually exclusive. In a moment, we're going to talk about prospecting by inclusion, where you look for particular things in people and become friends with them because of that. That's the opposite of what we just talked about. Prospecting by exclusion, where you disregard or dislike, and that leads you to crossing people off your possible friendship list. We do both at the same time. That is to say, we can prospect by exclusion and by inclusion at the same time. And so these are not mutually exclusive. It would behoove you at this point to ask yourself, having just understood Mary Roden's research about prospecting by exclusion, so what are my dislike and disregard criteria? Are there people I've crossed off my list of possible friends because I've disregarded them? I think pondering these things is important because if you do so, you'll begin to find out more about yourself. You might not like what you find, but you will find out more about yourself. Well, I said a moment ago, the opposite of prospecting by exclusion is prospecting by inclusion. And that's the research of Beverly fear, F-E-H-R. Beverly Fear's research finds that oftentimes we look for certain things in people, and if they have those qualities, then we are more likely to try and bring them into friendship with us. Now, let me talk about 4 things in her research that seem to correlate the strongest with the kinds of things we look for in people to include them as our friend. First is some sense of similarity. Now, similarity can mean anything. It can be that we're both from the Church of Christ. It can be that we're both male. It can be that we're both stuck in a class called American Politics. It can be that we're both recently divorced. It can be that we both go to a yoga class every Tuesday night. There's some kind of similarity that we perceive. Oftentimes, college students will become friends with people from the same area back home. There's been research done on people that join the military that finds that oftentimes they look for people from the same part of the country as them, and they become friends with them. Similarity can be many different things, but the point of the matter is, when we perceive similarity, then we're more likely to become friends with someone. Now, obviously, there are communicative dimensions to that, because in order to perceive similarity, I have to talk to people. And once I perceive similarity, that's going to change the kind of communication I have with someone. So a second point of inclusion in Beverly Fear's research is what's called reciprocity. The notion of reciprocity as it's used here is this idea that says, I reach out to you to be a friend, and you reach back to me. So if I invite you to go to coffee, you invite me the next week to go to coffee. Or if I sit next to you in class, then the next time the class meets, you don't sit purposely in a different part of the room, so you don't have to sit by me. So reciprocity, in a sense, is responding in a positive, expected way to some kind of outreach for friendship. And again, this can look different from one context to the next, but reciprocity becomes important because it affirms to us that the friendship is taking root. So the more reciprocity there is, the more momentum the friendship has, and it's more likely to continue on. The third idea from Fear's research is what's called social skills. Now, this one might make you a bit less comfortable, but Fear's research finds that people that have more social skills are better at including people in their friendships. So what kind of social skills is Fear talking about? The ability to hold a conversation, the ability to make people laugh, the ability not to be weird or off-putting. Now, these are all what are called soft skills that are very difficult to teach. And in fact, some people just tend to have them or not have them. So for example, people that are outgoing tend to have more friends by inclusion than people that are reserved or that are introverted. Because reserved, shy, introverted people tend not to have the kind of social skills that other people see as being valuable in making friendships. So the idea of social skills might make us uncomfortable, but in Fear's research, she finds that social skills, or at least our perception of them, plays an important part in the inclusion process. And finally, and perhaps most controversially, are what is called physical attractiveness. The reality is people that are physically attractive tend to have more friends than people that are not. And people that are physically attractive, or people that think they're physically attractive, tend to reach out to other friends that are themselves physically attractive. Now, this makes people very uncomfortable, but Fear finds that oftentimes people are friends with other individuals that are roughly the same level of attractiveness as they are. Now, that makes us really uncomfortable because it makes it sound as if people that are not as physically attractive are doomed to not have friendships. That's not what Fear is saying. Instead, what Fear is saying is that one more narrow outgrowth of similarity is this idea of physical attractiveness. That if I think I'm physically attractive, I'm more likely to reach out to others who are about as physically attractive as I think I am. Alternatively, another way to see this is to say that Fear's research is telling us that people who are physically attractive are more likely to attract individuals to them and thus create this dynamic of inclusion. Now, whether it be social skills or reciprocity or anything else, in the big picture, what Fear is simply trying to say is that we look for friends by trying to identify certain attributes in people and then bring them into our friendship because of them. A third way of looking at the initiation and growth of friendships is what's called proximity thesis. This is the research of Edward Ebbison, E-B-B-E-S-O-N, Ebbison. Edward Ebbison's research argues that the way we become friends with someone is by interacting with them in the future. It's time spent together. It's the number or frequency of interactions. For Ebbison, we become friends with people we tend to spend the most time with. Now, that doesn't simplistically mean that all you have to do to be friends with someone is spend a lot of time with them. That's not the case. What Ebbison is saying is the more frequent your interactions with someone, the more likely you are to become friends with that person. When you mesh that with notions of prospecting by inclusion from Beverly Fear, you can begin to see how it is people become friends. So think about your own experiences. You arrive on the first day of a college class and you sit down next to someone. Chances are pretty good that if you both attend class regularly, over the next 15 weeks or so, if you choose to sit next to each other, you will have high proximity. And so in the normal ebb and flow of before class and after class and maybe even during class, the two of you begin to communicate. That creates the basis for the possibility of some kind of a friendship. Even if it's just a casual kind of a friendship, the fact of the matter is you've now become friends with someone almost exclusively because of proximity. And that also explains why it is when the proximity begins to diminish, we're less likely to maintain friendships with people. So if you're friends with someone because you both work as baristas at a coffee shop, when you leave that job and go to another one, because you're not interacting with that person in the same way, with the same frequency, your friendship is likely to suffer. Now, it doesn't mean the friendship's going to evaporate. And in particular with social media, you might be able to maintain more contact with that person than you otherwise might. But the research is very clear. If you're not working with that person face to face on a regular basis, the proximity begins to diminish, and therefore the friendship is likely to also diminish. The next broad idea to understand the initiation and growth of friendships comes from Henry Goldner, Goldner, Goldner. Goldner talks about something that a lot of people intuitively know but don't want to articulate because it makes us seem shallow. Kind of sounds bad. Henry Goldner talks about friendship availability. Goldner's idea is simply this: we only have room for so many friends in our life at any given point in time. There's a ceiling to it. It's a scarce resource. I can only squeeze so many friends into my mental and emotional and social world. And so therefore I have a limited friendship budget. So I can only have so many close friends. I can only have so many best friends. Now, I might have a limitless number of casual friends or acquaintances, but the fact of the matter is, for people that are genuinely and truly friends, there is a limit to that. Now, this makes people uncomfortable because we'd like to think that we can have as many friends as we would like. And some people will say, what? Goldner's crazy. I've got 2,000 friends on Facebook. Well, first of all, Goldner would say they're not all really your friends. Let's be more narrow in the terminology we're using. All he's trying to say is that for people that are genuinely in our orbit, people we consider friends, most of us have some number that maximizes that, and you don't go beyond that. Now, one person can move from being a close friend out to being a more casual friend, and so a spot opens up for someone to move from being a casual friend to a close friend. But the reality is you're not going to expand the number of close friends that you have. So now the question, of course, is, what's that number? Well, there's a research called Dolan's number, D-O-L-A-N, and it's named after an individual in Great Britain who tried to put a number on this limit of friendships that we might actually have. Dolan argues that the average adult can only maintain a grand total of 150 relationships of all kinds. Now, within that 150, we're likely to parse them out into close friends and casual friends and genuine friends. But the reality is that we really only have room for 150 people. The online friends we have, those 2,000 friends you have on Facebook, they don't count. 150 of them might count if they're part of that 150, but anything beyond 150, and they're not really friends. They might be friends in name, but they're not friends in fact. Now, if you start to interact with them face to face over a period of time, then they might move into the 150 and someone else moves out. But Dolan's number wants to say we have room really for about 150 people in our life. Now, that's an overarching kind of a number. Subsequent research has tried to actually put a specific number on it. And here's what that research finds. Most adults' average friend budget runs like this. Most of us can have 5 core people in our life, 5 best friends, 5 go-to people, 5 people we feel really tight with, for whatever reason, with whatever backstory. And then we have about 10 to 15 close friends, people we interact with on a regular basis, people we would say we are psychically close to. then we can have about 35 reasonably strong contacts, meaning 35 people we interact with on a regular basis. We feel highly comfortable with them. And then we have about 100 casual friends. People that we see every now and again, we consider them friends, we can resume our friendship whenever we see each other, but that's the extent of it. So 5 core people, 10 to 15 close friends, 35 reasonably strong contacts, and then about 100 casual friends. That's it. The rest are friend in name only. Now don't get bogged down in the numbers. All Goldner was trying to say is that there's a finite space in our life for friends. And he wants us to admit that. He doesn't think that's a shortcoming. He thinks it's just the way it is. And so while humans are social creatures, there is a limit to all of that. So another way of looking at the initiation and growth of friendships is what's called network proximity thesis. This is the research of Michelle Parks. Parks wants to recognize the fact that sometimes we become friends with people not because we choose to, but because they're the friends of our friends. Or to put it differently, we join someone else's friendship network, and so therefore the people in that network become our friends. And so the people in that network are all of a sudden proximate to us. So you're dating somebody, and that somebody happens to have a circle of friends. And so you inevitably end up spending time not just with the person you're dating, but with the person you're dating and that person's friends. You share meals together, or you do things together. Who knows? So the idea then is that your beloved's friends inevitably become your friends. Why? Well, because of network proximity thesis. So Parks argued that this is particularly true of people that are single, and particularly true of people that are under the age of 30. Or to put it differently, it's particularly true of emerging adults. Now, of course, people that are in their 50s or people that are married can have network proximity, but it's far more common for people at your point in life as a college student. It's far more common for people that are single. And the reason for that is because single people tend to have more friendships in their life than do married people. Married people tend to turn inward and therefore have fewer friendships than people that are single. So what Parks wants to recognize is that while there might be some prospecting by exclusion and inclusion and all that other stuff we've talked about, for some of us, some of our friends are inherited because they are given to us as part of the network of someone else that we know. Now, let me call time out for a moment and talk about one researcher who has a bit of a different take on all of this friendship initiation stuff. Heather Helms Erickson, Helms-Erickson, is a researcher who wants to answer this question. Why is it that sometimes people become friends with the wrong people? Why is it that sometimes people become friends with individuals that are bad for them, that end up helping them make unhealthy life choices, or people that lead them into difficult circumstances? Helms-Erickson's answer to that is this: turmoil analysis. Erickson argues that when we experience turmoil in our life, we are more likely to enter into detrimental friendships. A detrimental friendship is one that's bad for you. It hurts you in some way. It's not ideal. It drags you down rather than raising you up. And Helms-Erickson notes that oftentimes when people experience turmoil, a divorce, for example, the breakup of a long-term romantic relationship, a death in the family, unemployment, some kind of turmoil in your life puts you in a state of mind when you're hungry for any kind of relationship. And oftentimes in that moment of hunger, you're vulnerable to opening yourself up to a relationship that you might not otherwise have opened yourself up to. So in the midst of this turmoil, in essence, your guard is lowered. In essence, the standards you might have had for friends are also lowered. And so maybe your dislike criteria changes, or your disregard criteria is turned off. Or maybe you begin to see similarity in places that you previously would not have found similarity. And so in Helms-Erickson's research, there are 3 very clear precipitators of turmoil. 3 circumstances that in particular have correlated with people entering into detrimental friendships. Or to put it differently, if you experience one of these 3 circumstances, you are statistically speaking at higher risk of entering into a detrimental friendship. So what are those contexts, or what are those circumstances? Number 1, the transition from high school to college. Number two, the transition from college to a job or a circumstance after college. And number three, the divorce of your parents. And so if you're an emerging adult and you are transitioning from high school to college, statistically speaking, when you get to college, you're at a greater risk of falling into a friendship that is detrimental. Likewise, when you graduate from Oklahoma Christian and you move to a different city to get your first job, or even if you stay in this town and get your first job, you are statistically speaking more likely to enter into a detrimental friendship. Could be someone you work with, could be your next door neighbor, but at that point in time, because there's more turmoil in your life, you are more likely to enter into a detrimental friendship. Now, of course, you can enter into a detrimental friendship at any time. But Helms-Ericsson's research simply says that in certain periods of our life, when we go through a change of the life cycle, we're simply more likely to enter into those kinds of relationships. Another broad way of looking at the initiation and growth of friendships comes from Steve Duck, D-U-C-K. At the University of Iowa, Duck has done research, and he has stumbled onto what he calls reinforcement analysis. Reinforcement analysis, as the name suggests, is that we oftentimes enter into friendships that will reinforce or reflect views we have of ourselves. Because I see myself as a certain way, I specifically look for friends that are also that way. That's the similarity that we talked about a few moments ago. But for Duck, he takes it one step further. And his argument is that as we enter into those friendships, we end up reinforcing our view of ourselves. So, if I am a student athlete, and athletics has been a big part of my life through junior high and high school, when I get to college, I look to make friends with other student athletes, specifically people on my team. And so, because of proximity, we know that I'm likely to be friends with them because of the amount of time spent together. Because of the similarity idea that we talked about with prospecting by inclusion, I'm likely to see similarity between myself and the other players on the team. So to that, Duck would add that I look for people specifically that will reinforce my views of myself. So if I see myself as a student athlete who has a different set of expectations than do non-student athletes, I look for friends that reinforce that view of myself. And so for Duck, our friendship prospecting is very much a product of wanting to prop up how it is we see ourselves. This is especially true of friendship circles. So again, if you think of the plastics that are depicted in the movie Mean Girls, the females that are part of that friendship circle all are having their views of themselves as special and set apart from the others, reinforced by virtue of their friendships with the other plastics. Ironically, I see some of this on campus at Oklahoma Christian, when people will join a service club, and because each service club often has its own kind of identity, there's a kind of reinforcement effect. So that if you join Club X because you think Club X fits you, you begin to have reinforced your idea that I am Y, because a lot of people in Club X are Y, and you can fill in the blank to whatever variables X and Y happen to be. Regardless, Duck simply wants to argue that we oftentimes maintain friendships because we have reinforced the views we have of ourselves. If I decide to quit the team, then I no longer have the desire to need to reinforce that view, and so I'm likely, not just because of proximity changes and similarity changes, to fall out of friendship with those people. Yet another way to look at the initiation and growth of friendships comes in convergence analysis. Convergence analysis is by Frank Deutsch, D-E-U-T-S-C-H, Deutsch. Deutsch wants to call convergence analysis another outgrowth of what happens as we maintain friendships. The word convergence means things are coming together. Convergence analysis, for Frank Deutsch, says that the more we are friends with people, the more the similarities among that friendship begins to rise. Or to put it differently, the longer I'm friends with you, the more I'm likely to see similarities between us, or the more I'm likely to hold on to and focus on whatever similarities are there. So the idea then is that at this point in your life, as emerging adults, you enter into friendships with people that you perceive to be somewhat similar to you. Fine, fair enough. Well, Deutsch argues that over time, there tends to be this convergence where those similarities become more real, those similarities become more evident, those similarities become more a part of your friendship. And so therefore, for Deutsch, not only does that reaffirm who you are, which was Steve Duck's analysis a moment ago, but those similarities that you perceive begin to rise. You begin to see even more similarities. Now that's important because the more similarities you see, the more likely you are to see value in maintaining the friendship. So Deutsch and Duck, the two researchers we've just talked about, are more interested in talking about the maintenance of friendships than they are the initiation of friendships. What Duck and Deutsch are saying fundamentally is this: as friendships continue on, we have reinforced our view of ourselves, and one reason that happens is because we begin to see again and again and again the reaffirmation of the similarities we have between ourselves and other people. Now, this takes us to the last idea we'll talk about, which is what's called investment and equity analysis. Investment and equity analysis comes from Edwin Hatfield, Hatfield. Hatfield wants to make an economic kind of an argument about the nature of friendships. For Hatfield, we maintain friendships because of our perception of equity and investment. Or to put it differently, Hatfield believes we maintain our friendships if we believe that people are putting into the friendship what they should be putting into the friendship, and that we are getting out of the friendship what we think we should get out of the friendship. So for Hatfield, we make these mental assessments of what other people are putting in and what we are getting out of our friendships. And if we're happy with what we're getting out of the friendship, and if we're happy with what the other person is putting into the friendship, then Hatfield suggests that the friendship will continue on. But if we perceive to be detriment in any of those areas, if we're not getting what we think we should, if the other person is not putting what we think they should be into the relationship, then we're out. So the idea then is that people are making these assessments in a subconscious kind of a way. Each of us idiosyncratically might look for this or that to measure investment or to understand whether we're getting out of the relationship what we should. That's idiosyncratic. And it's impossible to point to every single thing that counts as investment or anything else. But it is real. And Hatfield argues that sometimes on the spot, in the spur of the moment, we come to understand this investment and this equity. Other times, it just kind of rides along below the surface, and it's just part of the friendship. Now, Hatfield is not trying to say that I have to put as much into the friendship as you do. He's not saying that it's necessarily equal. I can put a lot more in than you do, or you can put a lot more in than I do. The key is that we find what he calls tolerable equity. So it might be that I'm comfortable putting less into this relationship than you are, or I'm comfortable putting more in than you are. It doesn't have to be balanced. If I'm comfortable at this point, then it's okay. If I'm comfortable at this point, that's okay. I have to be comfortable. I have to be able to tolerate that inequity. And so what Hatfield would argue is that each friendship has to find its own particular balance. And more narrowly, each person in the friendship has to find his or her own tolerable balance of equity. The key is to find that. One of the things that Hatfield does point out in his research is that unbalanced initiation friendships are quite common. That is to say, it's quite common for friendships to begin initially in this kind of a setting and then over time to balance out. Now, thinking about investment and equity analysis, I would challenge you to consider your own friendships and ask yourself, how balanced are my friendships? How much investment and equity do I need in order to be satisfied? And what counts as an investment and equity? Again, it would be impossible for me to identify every single thing that people think of when they try and measure the investment of people in friendships. For some people, it's time spent. For some people, it's William Rawlins's idea of being there. But whatever it is, in the back of our mind, we do tend to think about investment and equity. So, whether it's the kinds of things we've talked about most recently, investment and equity, whether it be what happens as friendships are maintained with things like reinforcement, or whether it's simply prospecting by inclusion and exclusion, the reality is that friendships are initiated, they grow, and they are maintained according to certain dynamics. And these dynamics all have communicative manifestations. And while we might not be able to put every single communicative manifestation on the table, we know that they are there nonetheless. And again, all of this reflects the tension between idiosyncrasy and universality. Universally, we know a lot about the initiation and growth of friendships. It has to do with friendship budgets. It has to do with prospecting by exclusion. But at the same time, there's idiosyncrasy here. And every person has different ways of measuring what counts as investment. Every person has a different way of measuring what counts as similarity. And so the tension between universality and idiosyncrasy is especially on display when we talk about the research into friendship communication. Well, there's more to be said about the communication that occurs in friendship. And so in future modules, we'll look at that research and talk about some more narrow manifestations of friendship.